changes.
Sorry, it was recording before. I just started it again. Go on. It's okay.
Okay. So what struck me about it was that the sort of rules that had emerged around identity politics, particularly when it was online. For example, the traditional assumption about ad hominem attacks on people, where you play the ball and not the player, the player and not the ball, that's been inverted. So now ad hominem attacks are sort of sacralized. Except you say, this is my opinion, and you've got to listen to it, and you're oppressing me if you don't believe me. Personal attacks became normalized online. I thought, this is very strange. Why are we tolerating this? And also this self-indignant rage. And I thought, well, rage is okay to start with. It's a good motivator, a bit like anxiety. But if that's your only goal in life, well, it seems to me just it's going to be destructive, and it's not going to be transformative. So it's very depressing. And I came across recently a concept from Loic Lacan, who's a French sociologist. I read this, by the way, since I wrote the book, but he's got this lovely phrase, and he talks about discussions of race and ethnicity and the difficulties and problems created by what he calls the logic of the trial. The logic of the trial. And what by that he means that we have now entered a world in which we presume in advance that somebody's guilty until proved innocent, and then we fit our facts around it. And he says it's our duty, really, if we are open-minded, to step back and avoid the logic of the trial, but we all get sucked into it individually, in terms of moralizations of individuals, but sometimes collectively as well. And I think that's a useful concept from Lacan. So, what was the general drift, my intuition about identity politics before I started poking around about what people had written? Well, it was the sense that people are inside groups, and we were good, and you lot out there are either bad or are suspect. So it's a sort of in-out dynamic for the group. We are good, you lot out there are bad or suspect. And alongside that is that my experience is sovereign. And this is known technically in philosophy as epistemological privileging, whereby we say, and it's become now this, again, a sacralized notion of lived experience, which is considered to be all important now in our analysis of power. Now, there's nothing wrong with lived experience. All this, I don't really know what experience can be other than lived, but leaving that aside as a contradiction, there's nothing wrong in a sense with people saying what they feel and what their experiences are. The problem is where you then position that in terms of your general analysis of power. And at this point, this is why I need, I think, to just divert for a few minutes into a philosophical point. And this is really my use of critical realism in the book, which I've used before, because it's the only thing that gives me comfort that I can understand complexity. Critical realism, for those who don't know, was developed by an Anglo-Indian philosopher called Roy Bhaskar in Oxford. He died in 2015. Just before that, he moved to the Institute of Education. And Bhaskar's philosophy, which is post-Marxian, post-Popperian, said that the world exists. It exists outsiders and insiders. It's independent of what we think of it. It just exists. This is called ontological realism, technically. Okay. But he also said, we do, as language users, describe reality inside and outside of us. So language is important, and he called this epistemological relativism. And Bhaskar's point was, most philosophers since Plato have been preoccupied with epistemology, have been preoccupied with knowledge. And he said, philosophy has largely forgotten reality itself, ontology, outside and inside reality. That's the second main point he made. The third main point he made was that we make judgments based upon evidence and logic in a fair-minded and honest way. We have a capacity as human beings to make judgments about truth. So for critical realists, truth is not a dirty word. It's problematic, it's difficult, you should be skeptical, but it's not a dirty word. Unlike in postmodernism, for instance, where there's an unending relativism and truth is always placed rather scornfully in inverted commas. Example would be, classic example given by Isaiah Berlin, who said, you know, we can talk about the German population being depopulated in the 1940s. We can say that millions of people were killed. We can say that millions of people died. Or we can say that the German state systematically murdered 6 million Jews and Roma people. Now, there are all different ways of describing what happened in the 1940s. Critical realists would say that the last statement most accurately describes the truth. So truth statements are okay. So that's just a general background. Now, a resource that critical realists often use from Bhaskar, which I use in this book, and this is what I really want to come on to, is what he called our four-planar social being, which means that reality is laminated and we can understand it in terms of four main domains. The first domain is our relationship with nature. We came from nature and we will return to it. And nature rumbles on, and it will rumble on when our species dies, not just when we as individuals die. It will still be there and it will play by certain rules, which natural science has helped us to understand. So nature is important, biology is important. Secondly, the next level up, he called relationality. The next level of reality, he called relationality. So from the moment that we are conceived, we relate to another human being in the womb. Arguably, relationality starts before that with our parents having sexual intercourse. So relationality is something that is woven through conception, birth. We then relate to our parents, school friends, workmates, and then we die in a social way as well, because there are people around us usually when we die. So relationality is really important if we're trying to understand being a human being. Now, this is the stuff of attachment theory, developmental psychology, psychoanalysis, social psychology, microsociology. These inform relationality, our understanding of it. The third layer in the four-planar are social and economic structures. And these are often unknown to us. We're thrown into a world in which they exist. We're unaware of them. They shape our existence and our experience. And we can go from cradle to grave, be more or less aware of them. Social outside, like insight, is variable, but it's there. Social and economic structures are important. And the final plane, which is the stuff of existentialism and humanism, is our unique singularity, our concrete singularity. We're unique human beings. Religious people might call that the soul. Secularists call it personality. So Bhaskar said, if we were going to be good human scientists, we need to keep, it's like keeping four balls in the air at the same time. Now, this is not easy because we are schooled, we're socialized within discipline to tend to understand only one of the four. But he says, if we're going to do this job properly, we need all four. Now, this is the quick key point. If nothing else, try and remember this. My main point in the book is that I think identity politics has dropped two of those balls because it's become preoccupied with only two planes of reality, which are relationality, i.e. group membership, and personal experience, the fourth plane. It's tended to background or ignore or play down or selectively use biology on the one hand and social structure on the other. And this is its fundamental failing. Okay, and that means it's entered a sort of cul-de-sac of words and words about words and indignation. And its focus, there's nothing wrong with its starting point. It's a good place to start. You know, there's nothing wrong with reporting your constrained citizenship. If you're a raped woman, report that you've been raped, and that's an example of patriarchy. If you're a black person being followed around a supermarket by a security guard, it's an example of racism. So this is not to in any way disrespect the experiences of people who are oppressed, but it is to say, if we only limit our attention to those two planes, it will lead to an uneven understanding of power. This is a problem. And it then leads to a sort of indignant position whereby we silence people, censor them, etc., cancel them, the stuff that David was talking about at the beginning. Okay, so given all that stuff, what did I then move on to address? I looked at freedom of expression. I look at sex and gender. I look at, what else did I look at? Mental health politics. I had another chapter called Class, Blood and Soil, where I look at class and nationalism. And so these chapters really try to address the smattering of identity politics, right, left, and centre. And what you might notice if you're aware of the sociology of this is that they're heavily embedded in new social movements. Now, new social movements are something that are not conflatable with identity politics. The reason for that is that new social movements, which largely emerged in the 60s, starting with anti-racism in the United States and then second wave feminism, they also included movements which were not to do with special pleading for groups. For example, they included animal liberation, they included ecology, they included campaign for nuclear disarmament, which were more about the whole species. But my interest is in the overlap where people special plead for particular groups. And that's what identity politics is about. Okay. So having looked at these questions through the lens of these topics, I came up with some interesting findings. One of them was that the indignation of identity politics extends to people who've got actually very dubious motives. Let me give you an example. In the chapter I do on antisocial sexual identities, the logic of identity politics is used very, very gleefully by paedophiles, by incels, men who can't get sexual partners and then go around killing people. I use another case study of BDSM and the ambiguities of domination of other human beings. It's a grey area, BDSM, but that chapter tries to highlight that there are a lot of life-negating forces in identity politics. It can be very violent and nasty, whereas the left have tended to pick up its emphasis upon social justice around issues, particularly around race and gender. But to do it properly, we can see that identity politics is co-opted actually for a range of reasons, a range of forms of special pleading. Okay, so basically they were the chapters, and if you get the book, you can read more of them in detail. So what did I then, having looked at these topics, what were the main conclusions that I came to? I had mainly 6 lessons. I could have collapsed them, but I've called them 6. 6 is a sort of round number, I suppose. And the first lesson I learned was that there is a spectrum of legitimacy in identity politics. This comes back to the point that it's not all ridiculous. It starts with legitimate claims. It does actually start with claims of oppression. And there's nothing wrong with that. And for that reason, when we think about the wide mixture of groups that special plead within identity politics, I created a sort of spectrum. If you read the book, you may disagree with the way I've ranked them, but that doesn't matter. We could discuss that. But at the top, I've put global anti-poverty movements, for instance, sex-based rights, basically around women and children through second wave feminism. I'd put those right at the top. And right at the bottom, I'd put theocrats, like ISIS, like Hindu nationalism. I'd put paedophiles and incels. They've got really low legitimacy, but they all use the logic of identity politics, which is a preoccupation with in-group membership, personal experience, privileged personal experience. So that's the first general point to make, which is about this spectrum. Okay, so it moves from very wholesome demands, claims, to very dubious ones in that spectrum. The second general point I wanted to make, which was basically that the left has taken the wrong turn, a massive wrong turn with identity politics. I'm not the first person to say that. People like Eric Hobsbawm said it in the 90s. A. Sivanandan said it. A great essay by Mark Fisher called "Exiting the Vampire's Castle" made these points. So I'm integrating many points that they make. And what did they say? Well, they said that the focus on injustice on the left understandably encourages critical social justice warriors. Understandably that, because the left has always been indignant about injustice. So that's fed this. It's a starting point. But the left has also had a tendency towards authoritarianism and dogmatism. It's a tendency to be so indignant that it thinks that its enemies deserve to be killed. So if you take something like Rousseau's comment, eat the rich, which is a sort of anarchist slogan, that sort of cannibalistic idea of eating your enemy, killing your enemy through eating them. You then might still, even with that, say, well, would the menu include Jeffrey Epstein as well as Engels? Marx couldn't have existed without Engels, and yet Engels was rich. What about Bill Gates? So what about philanthropists? Should we kill all the rich? And there is a feeling sometimes on the left that the left actually hate the rich more than they love the poor. So there is a lot of intemperate, bad feeling, hatred, cannibalistic, sadistic feeling on the left generally. And that's quickly can culminate, I think, in authoritarianism, as we've seen. We've seen it in Leninism, but I think we're now seeing it from a different mode through identity politics. And that started in America. And the justification of hatred of outgroup members is very common. Okay, so they're some of the influences, I think, that energized it. And with that came, I think, a very worrying ambivalence about the Enlightenment project. Because what are the left to do with that? Are they going to honor it, genuinely honor it, in terms of freedom of expression, for instance, and tolerating dissent and tolerating difference, including difference they don't like? Or are they going to squash it and cancel and censor, which is another option? And we're seeing that drift within identity politics. And finally, I think that movement on the left has been encouraged by post-structuralism, by the postmodern term. And I'll come on to that again in a minute when I talk about critical theory. Okay, so that's the second lesson. The third lesson, I think, is that although I've complained that identity politics is about a form of psychological reductionism, because it focuses unduly on group membership and personal experience, it's also the case that we need psychology. We need more psychology in a way to understand what identity politics is about. Well, what is it about psychologically? Now, one way into this is through cognitive psychology, and another, I think, is in-depth psychology. So first of all, if we take the psychoanalytical tradition, it largely reflects the human tendency to defend the ego against threats from without and within. And these mechanisms would include splitting into good and bad. They would include projection, projective identification, would also include rationalization. We rationalize our viewpoint as being coherent all the time, when in fact it's full of contradictions. We don't like to admit that. So the whole tradition of defense mechanism arguments within psychoanalysis, I think, is one way into understanding what's going on in identity politics. But the other way, and it's mutually supportive, is actually cognitive psychology, particularly the work of people like Kahneman, and also Kevin Dutton, who's written a very interesting book called Black and White Thinking. Now, cognitive psychologists talk about two types of reasoning. Slow and fast reasoning, sometimes it's called primary and secondary, first type, second type. It's got different names in cognitive psychology. But the gist of this is that through evolution, we learned as primates to identify threat. And therefore, when we were walking along in the jungle, we could turn our bow to a threat, which might be a creek. Now that could be a prey, and it could be food, or it could be somebody attacking us. So the argument from evolutionary psychology and cognitive psychology is that it's actually quite useful sometimes to make rapid judgments. We sometimes need to make rapid judgments. There's nothing wrong with that, and it keeps us healthy and safe sometimes. However, it's absolutely terrible to continue to use that process in an everyday life in a complex world. We've also developed the capacity to think slowly, to think in a more considered way, to tolerate uncertainty, to tolerate contradictions, and to admit that you don't know things. Sometimes we just don't know things. In fact, if you're a critical realist, you would say you don't know most things. Most of reality is absent. We're completely clueless most of the time about what's going on inside us and outside us. So we're bumbling along from birth to death in a state of ignorance most of the time. And yet what identity politics does is draws us back into that first mode of thinking, which is, I know for certain that this is true. You are my enemy. You are my morally inferior, and you deserve to be cancelled, or whatever the judgment is at the time. Now, developmental theorists such as Susan Neiman, in a very interesting book called Moral Clarity, I don't know if people know this book, which is about the development of morality, argues in defending the Enlightenment project that mature human beings have a capacity to operate in both modes, but particularly when required in second mode. And what identity politics, I think, has done is locate people in a very fixated or regressed way into an immature way of thinking, which is about splitting good and bad, inside good, outside bad, etc. This is the stuff of identity politics. Another psychologist I think writes well on this is a friend of mine called Richard Bentel, who's written about delusions, and he makes the point that delusional thinking or rigid thinking actually is something that actually is on a continuum in all human beings. He makes this point well, and he says that we're wrong to think that paranoid processes are located in people we label as paranoidally psychotic, but they actually operate in all of us to some degree. And the reason for this is that we've got this elaborated way of actually seeing threat and symbolizing it and turning it into what in extreme form is called a delusion. Okay, now he argues quite rightly that other animals think, but then they can't get deluded like us. For example, he gives an example that a dog will sit quietly by your cupboard because he knows there's food in the cupboard, and when you go to it, you might feed the dog. But the dog will never become a jihadist. So the dog thinks it can understand what's happening, but it can't elevate that thought process into a delusional thought, a rigid delusional thought. So I think cognitive psychology and depth psychology both make a contribution to understanding what's going on. I think we need more of this. So that's the third main point. The fourth point I make is that we need an alternative philosophy. And I think I've made that case earlier. My view is that we need to step away from postmodernism. I think it's been a wrong turn. I think the preoccupation with language and perspectivism has actually been misleading. I think it's led us to a belief in ending relativism, when in fact we should have anchor points in reality. Equally though, naive realism from the past is not always helpful either, because that gets it wrong, because it assumes that we can verify truths when we can't. We can only make truth statements provisionally, and we should constantly be skeptical. So I do think we do need to get our hands dirty a little bit with philosophy, which I tried to argue earlier, to try to understand how we're going to avoid the pitfalls of identity politics. My penultimate lesson is that I think we should return to critical theory, particularly the Frankfurt School. Now, if you read writers on the right about this, they actually say that identity politics has been created by critical theory. And I actually think this is not true. If you read people like Jordan Peterson, they say this, but this is not accurate. Actually, identity politics came from two sources. It came from American individualism and liberalism within the left of America through the civil rights movement on the one hand, and then it was reinforced then by postmodern thinking. That's why we got things like queer theory and third wave feminism. These came from that amalgam of American individualism on the one hand and post-structuralism on the other, postmodern thought on the other, which together were melded to create, I think, identity politics in the main. There were other influences, but they're the main ones. And yet you will find right-wing thinkers say, oh, it's all about critical theory. They say it's about Marxism. It is not. It is not about Marxism. But that's my view in the book, and I defend that in the book. But I just wanted to flag that, really. And I think we do need to turn particularly to later Frankfurt School writers like Habermas and also his student Axel Honneth, who've written well on this topic. Which leads me to my final point and final lesson, which is if we don't have identity politics and we have become cynical about representative democracy, then what do we need instead? What should we do instead? And my solution at the end really is to move towards deliberative democracy. And there are, again, a number of people who've written on this. Habermas is one, Honath is another. Eric Fromm wrote about it even before them, by the way, in Sane Society and Escape from Freedom. But also more latterly, more other libertarian writers on, like Noam Chomsky in America, also David Graeber, the anarchist anthropologist who died a couple of years ago. The one who wrote Bullshit Jobs. I don't know if you know that book. He writes in these terms. Probably the most important writer, though, I think, in my view, is Hannah Arendt, particularly her book, The Promise of Politics, in which she makes the fair point that authoritarianism is constantly pregnant within representative democracy. She knew that because of the rise of Hitler. We've also rerun that since she died by the rise of Donald Trump. So representative democracy is no protection against authoritarianism. And she says the only real protection is to move towards the lessons of the earlier Soviets, the Paris Commune, and everyday cooperatives around direct democracy with our colleagues around us, using a spirit of respect and deliberation. That's why it's called, a deliberative form of democracy. So I think Arendt is an important writer. And another person I would commend is Nancy Fraser. Nancy Fraser is a person I think who many of you may know, but she's important because she's written about identity politics, and she talks about parity of participation. And she says, yes, critical social justice movements demand parity of participation, but you cannot demand this as a moralization. You have to understand the conditions of possibility that they can arise. We've got to understand parity of participation through structural analysis for a start. We can't just reduce it all the time to everyday moralizations, which are encouraged, for example, in equality and diversity training. So basically, that's a very quick run through for my thoughts in the book. And thank you very much for listening. I'll hand over to Pragna now.
Hi, David. That's really excellent. Thank you very much indeed. Outlining, I think, brilliantly, the attraction of black and white thinking. And I'm just wondering really about, Hannah Arendt's idea that respect and deliberation is somehow, how does that really resist the enormous attraction of black and white thinking? But maybe we can get on later to that. I'm going to hand over now to Pragna, who's going to, well, Pragna and David are going to have a discussion really. There's so much has come out in your talk, David. So Pragna, over to you.
Thank you so much. It's an absolute pleasure and an honor to be here. I think it is a really important and necessary book. And the more we can discuss what's wrong with identity politics, the better. Because I think I agree with you, David. I think it's taken a wrong turn. I wanted to come at this from the angle of how I started in politics and political activism, and what you said about, that the starting point of identity politics can be a legitimate starting point. It can be necessary, it can be important, it can be useful. So, when I became active in social justice movements, particularly anti-racist movements and feminism, it was in the 80s. And at a time, it was so necessary. And I was part of the anti-racist movements that, really called out racism, the kind of visceral racism that we saw in the 80s, kind of police brutality, the raw, violence of the National Front and other fascist fringe far-right groups and so on. And I was, caught up in the defense of Southall in 1979, where, the National Front tried to march through Southall in a very provocative manner, which was deemed to be extremely threatening and menacing. And it led to an entire community, a working class Asian community, coming out with activists, men and women, young and old, white activists as well as Black activists, in defense of Southall, in response to this the kind of fascist and racist provocation. And we formed Southall, apart from defense committees in relation to what transpired, which was police brutality against the anti-racist protesters, as opposed to the National Front presence. And it led to the death of the anti-racist activist Blair Peach. And it led to vandalism by the police of cultural centers, including a very famous cultural center that was inhabited by African Caribbean musicians and others. So coming out of that was the need to form as autonomous Black organizations to defend communities, but also to defend individuals against racism, to expose institutional racism, which took another decade. It took Stephen Lawrence before it was actually recognized. So in a way, that was my beginnings, and from that, as women, we felt the need to also challenge this idea that was beginning even then to take seed, which was that that Black struggles were essentially struggles against racism. And as women, we quickly realized that actually, reality is multi-layered. The struggle against racism is one struggle. It shapes some of our realities, but not all of it as women. And that we also had to tackle patriarchal structures and sexism, both outside of the community, but also inside the community. And so, out of that was born Southall Black Sisters, which was a secular, anti-racist, feminist organization. So in a way, the starting point was not a bad starting point. It was, I believe it was necessary, it was important. It was also, we were doing two things. One is challenging the wider anti-racist movement for its sexism, and on the other hand, challenging the burgeoning second wave feminist movement for its racism. And in a way that kind of ties in with what early identity politics around race and so on, how they began in the US, the Cohambee River Collective, so that SBS's political trajectory really is similar. But I think if I was to highlight the thing that made us different from, I think, what our race identity politics that we see at the moment, is that ours was an attempt to adopt an identity, the term Black, in a more inclusive and expansive way. So the politics behind it was that Black was a political term, borrowed very heavily from the civil rights movement in the US. It was not a descriptive term. So in other words, group membership was not about the color, but about whether you could come together, whether you identified because of your history of racism and history of colonialism. So Black was very much a mobilizing term, which we invested, in terms of our political values in a far more progressive way. So we're talking about using the term Black to mobilize around racism, but doing it in a way that was unifying different minorities rather than, simply narrowing the membership of the group. So to that extent, I think it was a unifying, it was a much more expansive term. And the aim of it, and certainly our early politics and the politics of many other Black organizations that began, and I have to say that Black was always a contested term. There were many within different minority communities who didn't accept the term Black, but nevertheless, within the anti-racist circles, Black was very much accepted as a very inclusive term. And the main thing about our organizing was that we saw ourselves as autonomous, but not separate from wider social justice movements. And ultimately, we recognized that actually, although we might begin by sort of confronting a kind of injustice and therefore addressing sectional interests, we're actually located in wider movements for social justice. And we have to create alliances and coalitions in order to succeed and to transform society into a more equal, egalitarian society. So that is what I think has changed. To answer the question, what has gone wrong with identity politics, if we look at race identity politics, that has changed so much now. The generation now do not understand that history of anti-racism, the mobilizing use of the term Black, and the attempts to use our autonomous organizations to actually forge solidarity with other groups. You know, so very much like gay and lesbian groups in the 80s mobilized in support of the miners' strike. Black people, of which I was a part, we mobilized in support of the miners' strike. Why? It wasn't because we didn't think, you know, that we thought that they were not racist or they were not sexist, but it was to find commonalities in our struggle. And in relation to the miners' strike, it was around the police brutality that the miners faced, and to make connections with the kind of police brutality that Black people faced, certainly Black men, but also Black women. It was to, you know, it was to forge connections. And that was, so these were genuine attempts to create solidarities, to actually link race, class, and sex in ways that really made a difference to how we looked at things. So, you know, for us, going to mining communities, standing on the picket line with miners was really important because it actually helped to break down prejudices. It actually helped to talk to each other, to through dialogue, through struggle, come to understand each other better and when our experiences better. And, you know, and it didn't mean that we were ready formed, you know, lefty progressive people, but we were trying dialogue, through the forging of solidarity, through coalition building, attempting to create those spaces. And I think that's what's gone. I mean, it hurts me enormously at a time like this that younger generations don't understand that history, but also, you know, to be told that you have no right to call yourself Black. And that is part of the identity politics problem, is that it's actually, I think, hollowed out. All politics, all progressive politics are hollowed out. And all it is what you call the kind of moral righteousness, self-indignation, sort of, and a race to the bottom, and a race to claim the ultimate status of victimhood. And I see that in the way in which identity politics has since developed. We've moved away. And I think that's partly what's gone wrong with the way we've taken the political values out of what we were trying to create, so that it's not clear anymore what's left or right. I think it's aided and abetted by neoliberalism, which you talk a lot about, the neoliberal you know, undercurrents that's fed identity politics to is I think a really important point. The role of social media is another really important point. But I also see that we have really got to a point where I'm not sure that we can distinguish between left and right because of what you say, which is the authoritarianism tendencies of the left. And I remember an Indian historian once say that if the left is behaving like the right, and he was talking about the rise of religious fundamentalism and religious identity politics, does it even deserve to be called the left anymore? You know, those are some of the things that are thrown up by my reading of your excellent book. The one thing I would say is that what it doesn't touch on, which I think is part of the answers to what's gone wrong, is we don't talk about the rise of multiculturalism as a state policy. And we don't talk about the kind of morphing of multiculturalism, which was always problematic, to what we now have, which is multi-faithism. Both rely on identity politics, but both are state imposed as opposed to self-defined within groups, you know. So back in the 80s, in the mid 80s, we were challenging multiculturalism because it had homogenized Black communities, it homogenized cultures, it failed to understand that there were differences within communities and fault lines along class, religion, caste, line, sex, sexuality, all these. It assumed that there were gatekeepers to communities that were representing the voice, authentic voice of the communities, as well as representing the kind of cultural and religious identity. So I think the problem with both anti-racism and state-imposed multiculturalism and now multi-faithism is that they have tended to homogenize minority communities in exactly the same way. And the result of that is that the more marginalized voices within the communities, the minorities within minorities, those voices are lost. And actually their rights are marginalized and their rights are trampled upon all the time. And actually their rights are being traded because in sort of in the need to promote a kind of group identity, you trade off the rights of the most vulnerable. So, you know, we can talk more about that side of things, multiculturalism and the sort of descent into multi-faithism, the beneficiaries of which have been religious fundamentalists, and a strengthening of the religious right, both Islamic, but also Hindu, Sikh in minority communities too. So I think, you know, I think we have a situation where the identity politics has basically replaced a politics that was more progressive, that tried to build alliances and coalitions, with a kind of politics that just wants to recognize difference for the sake of difference. And we replaced a struggle for equality with a struggle for recognition of diversity.
Thank you, Pragna. Can I just say briefly,
Yeah.
if I had this conversation a year ago, I would have put your point in about multiculturalism and multi-faithism. Thank you. Thanks for pointing out that omission. Thank you.
Okay. I think, David, do you want to respond any more to what Pragna said, or shall I throw it open now? What do you think?
No, I'm happy for it to go open now, David. That's fine.
And I'm going to throw it open now, and people can either wave or just put your mute off and join us online. I mean, I think raising one's hand is the official way of doing it, but no, maybe it doesn't have to be quite so formal as that. I found when we talk about identity politics that people often find it a bit sort of daunting to say anything about it. There's always a fear of saying the wrong thing. So hopefully, you know, a bit like with me with my talk about fake news the other day, the feeling that you have to be really careful when you're speaking about any issue at all. You know, it's so inhibiting. So hopefully we can overcome that tonight. And people feel free to join in with this excellent beginning.
Sorry, but I go. So I got to ask questions really quick.
Anand, yeah.
Is the discussion was about identity politics,
Yeah.
and where it went wrong. So hence one could point to the growing what you call division of society rather than integration. Because it is about the negatives of identity politics, it can be pointed out that identity politics has segregated society more, classifying people.
Did you hear that, you two? We'll take a few questions and thoughts. If people could put their videos on, it's much more sociable. It's a much more, it makes it a more interesting experience. Katrina, thank you. And thank you for putting the connection on to David's book. Thank you. Katrina, yeah.
I think, thank you very much.
Divide the population.
Sorry.
Yes.
We could probably. Oh, sorry, Anand, were you not finished? I do apologize.
Yes, sorry. Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to mute you, Anand, because I feel like sitting on the BBC. We've got a bad line, I'm afraid. So we're going over to our next speaker, as it were. Katrina, could you come back? Maybe.
Yeah, sorry. A lot of this is very, very interesting, rings very true. I arrived in London in the mid-80s, just the time of the Brixton riots. I lived in Brixton then. I was then a youth worker on the White City estate and so on. And so much of it rings so true about bringing classism, social class, poverty, disability, everything into the equation. And we've lost so much of that. I think we could be discussing this for hours. For me, the really big question is, what can we do to bring those discussions more into a wider arena and to encourage debate again? I've had a few of those conversations with David. I'm also a clinical psychologist. I work for UCL, and I'm one of the few people in my world that dares to speak up against some of those things. And on some occasions, it's even been suggested my timing of encouraging people to, I don't know, watch some talks by radical Black American feminists who argue against identity politics, that I've timed that in a really poor fashion, that it's very undermining. It's painful for people to even hear the suggestion that they mightn't go and watch a 15-minute TED talk, because this is perceived as very attacking or whatever else. How can we have some of those discussions in a way that even feels palatable so we can have them? We don't need to agree. I do not care. People don't need to agree. We need to be allowed to have some of those conversations. That is, I think, my biggest issue, really. And I'd love to hear other people's thoughts.
Thank you.
David, can I just briefly reply to that? Sadly, I think at the moment, the only people I hear defending that forum of freedom of expression are libertarians on the right, particularly some Tory MPs, actually.
Sure. Yeah.
And I just wish actually people in the Labour Party would say some similar things. That's just a plea for people in the Labour Party, because I'm tired of that request only falling on the sympathetic ears of Tory politicians.
Well, why do you think they don't? I mean, I feel like you. Why don't they?
Well, because I think that they've intellectually lazily accepted that identity politics is okay. Yeah. I don't think they think too much about it. I mean, that became very evident in the leadership contest of the Labour Party when they were all completely taken in by transactivism.
Yeah,
bizarre. It was bizarre. They wouldn't even have a discussion about it.
Yes.
You know?
Yes. Thanks.
Can I just say, I think it's really, really dangerous that those of us on the left have ceded the idea of freedom of expression to people on the right. Yes. Freedom of expression is one of the main and it's cornerstones of a liberal democracy, and we must reclaim it and not allow it to be represented purely on the right. And I think as far as identity politics is concerned, it is an inward trend. It is an inward trend that appeared first in quite benign forms in terms of mindfulness and yoga and, I don't know, inwardness, a focus on the self instead of reaching out to the other. And this is something that particularly concerns me as one of the co-founders of LGBT Alliance. Sexual orientation is how you relate to other people, the kind of relationships you want with relationships with people of the other sex, whereas the TQIA people who have stuck themselves onto the LGBT movement are concerned with themselves. It is an inwardness. And I think that this inwardness, which I feel is very much encouraged by online influences, is something that we need to discourage and encourage people to move outwards and change, look to society instead of this inwardness. Yeah. Sorry, that was too many things at once, I think.
That's really helpful. Contemplating one's navel as a psychic retreat. Anna. We've had a few questions. Anna, yeah.
Hi. Struggle. I wanted to bring in the kind of role of the moment of struggle. I think it's a retreat because people are feeling that powerlessness and they're going inwards. And some of those examples that Pragna was bringing up about, for example, the miners' strikes, that's when those identities break down. When you find yourself in a workplace occupation, on a picket line, in a strike with maybe colleagues even that you haven't spoken to, or in your neighborhood, your identities kind of crumble. You can't keep up the facade because you make common ground with people, relations change, the act of social reproduction in those moments changes when somebody, you know, brings out food to the picket line and you literally break bread with each other. And I mean, the answer then therefore is we need a higher level of real struggle, and not these, you know, what we've retreated into then is these little causes where people have mistaken the movement, or, you know, a bigger movement for their, you know, fighting for their corner, and all this retreat into legislation. And I think in some ways the retreat into all these legal cases as well. And that's not going to move us from a place where our own identities are, you know, brought into question and we see what we have in common. So the answer therefore is a, you know, a higher level of class struggle, which obviously is a big, you know, big project, and we can't make that happen. But I think that's where this retreat into identity politics fragments.
Yeah.
I mean, one very interesting example, and I think a kind of moment that's pregnant with possibilities. Unfortunately, I've not been in the thick of it, and so I'm not sure how the struggles have played out in reality. I think there are lots of different groups. Is the Grenfell tragedy, because the Grenfell tragedy has provided a moment for people who were affected to come together, and those who were affected were the poor. They were migrants. They were from minority backgrounds. They were from poor working class backgrounds, you know, and that is a moment that where that kind of that personal experience, together with sort of that collective understanding of what they've gone through together and sharing of their experiences and feeling, could, with the right leadership, be a moment of coming together regardless of the backgrounds of the people. So this is not, Grenfell is not about Muslims. It's not about the white working class, and it's not just about migrants. It's about all of these things and more. It's also about environmental politics. It's also, you know, about neoliberalism. It's a way in which we analyze the situation in which we find ourselves and are able to join those dots and allow for solidarity to emerge organically through that process of talking, of sharing, of seeing, you know, people in the same position. And I don't know to what extent that can happen, but for me, those are kind of, there are these moments where that is possible. Yeah. But I don't think we see enough of it. Another example that I would give is, you know, this horrendous policy on the part of the government to deport people to Rwanda, so-called illegal migrants to Rwanda. And, you know, there was this attempt, wasn't there, a few weeks ago, the plane never took off. Yeah. And if it did take off, there were about 5 people. And what I was really struck by was that it was interesting that the mobilizations around it were sort of people who were concerned about migrant rights. But where were the environmentalists? After all, a plane taking off with just 5 people raises enormous questions about, you know, the wastefulness and the carbon print involved, and the use and the kind of environmental destruction that's being wrought. And it was an opportunity to bring together these social actors, but in ways that connect those dots and allow for struggles to emerge organically as part of wider movements. That, I think, is one way out of identity politics. I'm also saying that, you know, I remember when the Rotherham child sexual abuse cases first surfaced, and then, of course, there were many, many others around the country. I was one of the few people that was, you know, sort of showing solidarity with the white girls, but I didn't see others. I didn't see Black feminists coming out and showing solidarity. Yeah. And that, you know, and there were Black feminists afterwards who talked about the fact that, you know, there are also Asian girls subject to sexual abuse, but we don't hear about them. I don't think it needed to be competitive. Yeah. What we needed to do was show empathy and sympathy to those who were the victims, but also then expand that discussion to include others who perhaps might be more invisible in these things. You know, instead what we saw was a right-wing media, right-wing identity politics being played out in the tabloid that, you know, demonized Muslims, and those in, you know, in the Asian communities denying and that, you know, that this was a problem. So neither of those positions were positions that I would, you know, both the positions that I would question. But it's about trying to do it at the same time without saying that one is more of a priority than the other. And it's trying to create that space to allow those solidarities to emerge. I think it needs vision. I think it needs a kind of, I've always felt that the way we move out of identity politics, the more I think about it, is to talk about a politics of solidarity. We've got to get back to a politics of solidarity, but also David in his book talks about, you know, reinvigorating democracy through participatory democracy as opposed to representative democracy. I completely agree with that. You know, we need to be able to do both. To challenge identity politics, we've got to defend democracy and democratic principles, including freedom of speech, but also universalism. Yeah. I think the retreat, the postmodernism sort of tendencies is also retreat from universal human rights principles and all of that, and move right into cultural relativism, which also impacts, and moral relativism, which also impacts on the rights of the vulnerable, including Black and minority women, who are really at the bottom of the pile in some ways. You know, we need to defend those principles of enlightenment without, you know, conceding, you know, without necessarily conceding that they are, you know, enlightenment devoid of history of colonialism and so on. So we need to do that. And we need to kind of think politics of solidarity. I think those are some of the ways I would say what needs to be done, you know, to even begin to move to unravel some of this, because it is dangerous. It's really dangerous. It's a politics, the authoritarianism of the left, right, below, and above.
It was rather sickening in the Grenfell Memorial, which I was around, that to see royalty coming in and sort of claiming some sort of right to be there. That was particularly awful. With the Rwanda, the refugees being sent off, exiled to Rwanda, it was a European Court of Human Rights that came to the rescue, and that was
enlightenment.
Yeah, enlightenment, which we're trying to decouple from. Abdul Ghani, hi, from Morocco, I believe. Yep.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone.
Hi, can you put your video on? It'd be nice to see you.
Yeah, okay.
Hi.
Okay. Hi. Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
I am happy to join you in this interesting have webinar. By the way, I am Abdul Ghani Moussaoui from Morocco. Okay, I am a PhD student. Okay, I am so interested I'm happy to listen to you because my area of interest is post-colonial studies, cultural studies. Okay, and I'd like to talk about this concept of identity in relation the politics of identity. I think we have usually when talking about the politics of identity or the identity politics, I think we usually think about the colonial discourse, Orientalist discourse. I think which means I think we should know the source we have, which means it's like the context in which we have this concept is created, because I think I think we have an idea about have this the concept of the contact zone by Homi Bhabha. Okay, so I think we have this problem of identity. I think we have because it has to do with this interaction between the colonized, the colonizer, and this is the beginning of the beginning of this. We have of talking about this, we have of this concept. So we have, I think, instead of problematizing, have these concepts. I think personally speaking, I think we should have I think scholars, intellectuals, we have writers, and we should reconsider so many things. Okay, the way, for example, we look at each other. We have that we always talk about this dichotomy between the West and the East, and we have and even when talking about the problem of identity, we have it's like also we are talking about nowadays about new colonialism. So we have so this is, I think, so this is the I think we have so many things that should be reconsidered, and we should change our way of perceiving things, how we look at each other. So instead of, I think have the concepts are concepts, but we have people should have particularly have scholars. And thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Absolutely. I mean, yes, one of the people at the Fake News podcast yesterday was talking about how post-colonial studies is almost banned in America now. It's seen as something that has to be ignored completely. The people people doing history don't touch on it. Okay, just come to the next question now, Abdul. We'll come back to you in a minute. Okay, Mary.
Okay.
Yeah. Mary. Your mute off.
Yes, I've unmuted myself.
That's it. Okay.
Yeah. Hello. Yes, I think I just wanted to say something about because I'm involved with thoughtful therapists and around in terms of gender. And one of the things I think I was responding to the remark about sort of retreating into court cases, but actually it's the only thing we can do at the moment. I mean, even protesting in the street becomes, we get threatened. I have to be very careful about who I speak to. We are constantly trying to engage with our professional membership. We get silenced and we can get deregistered. So actually the courts have become, with the Alison Bailey, with Kira Bell, with people, that they've become, because it'd be lovely if we could have these discussions, but I cannot have these discussions with colleagues in the NHS are too scared to talk about it. Exactly. They're busy being sent off into their racialized groups, or then having worked in London for a long time, I'm in Liverpool now, and looking at my professional membership magazine, I despair. So the courts are actually incredibly important as a step, and to expose it, because if you shine a light on, you can see how crazy it is and incoherent, this underneath driving forces that takes away from something that's that's about solidarity, that's about growth, that is about enlightenment, that's about connection. So I just wanted to say something about that.
That's very important. I was saying in another meeting about the fact that I've had my first person come for analysis for therapy who's doing a training, who was told by their training organization that if I didn't deal with identity politics right from the beginning, they should report on me. Okay, so it's sort of reporting on the analyst. If it becomes a political, it's that sort of idea. You get reported on if you don't agree with the political view. So
it's very worrying.
Informants in the consulting room, that sort of feeling. David and Pragna, do you want to say something about what people have been saying?
Pragna, please.
No, I don't know what you do about this current climate where everybody's just fearful. I think I'm seeing more people speak out there than a few years ago. And it's a good thing, because the more people are speaking out, the more people are beginning to see that the emperor really does have no clothes, And we're beginning to overcome that fear. Once some people speak out, others feel a bit more able to overcome their own fears. of being attacked and assaulted. I can see that it's difficult if you're a charity and you're relying on funded income. I can see that it's difficult if you're belonging to an organization where you can be deregistered and so on. So these are difficult obstacles, but politically we've got to find a way, as opposed to just relying on the courts. I think you're right. I think the legal space is the only space at the moment, you know, where we can have these arguments, but sort of hiding behind legalese, if you like. But that's a narrow discussion. It's inevitably a narrow discussion that focuses around the technicalities of the law.
Yeah.
And it's not a substitute for the political struggles that we need to have.
Yeah.
And that's the dilemma at the moment, is how are we going to come out of this quagmire and move in a direction that kind of, you know, had a sort of back to basic stuff about being able to talk to each other, respect each other, decency, with compassion, with empathy. All of these things are critical to that democratic dialogue that we need to have, and are the foundations upon which you build struggles. So, but I think that, you know, I think that some of the kind of capture, the organization, the policy capture that we've seen from certain quarters is waning a little bit, because people are speaking out. And I think that therein lies hope, because whereas once upon a time everybody was signing up to say, you know, whatever the Stonewall Charter was, say around the whole issue around trans persons and feminism, we're now beginning to see that more and more spaces are being created, and, you know, people are coming out and speaking out. So although that doesn't drown out the shouting and the accusations and the stigmatization that's going on, there is a little bit more hope that people.
I want to, I mean, you're absolutely right, Pragna, but I do want to agree with Mary, and I do think, unfortunately, the situation is much more serious than we perhaps want to realize. My colleague Kate Harris has described the gender identity ideology. I prefer not to speak about trans rights because I don't think that's what it's about, but the gender identity ideology as Japanese knotwood, which goes through every single institution in our country. And the reason why I am able, for instance, to speak out is because I'm old. I am financially secure. Yes. I cannot lose my job. My children are grown up. And I therefore have a duty. And that's why so many of us who are speaking out are people who are either old or who are in, for some reason, are financially more secure. Younger people cannot. Mary wanted to mention James Esses, who is a very, very principled young therapist who has expressed his worry about the way that gender dysphoria is being approached. He lost his position at university. He is now being forced to go to the courts. I do think that the situation, that before we come to the debate, Pragna, that you're so right that we need, I fear that we have to overcome far more resistance in unscrambling the omelette or getting rid of the Japanese knotweed than we perhaps want to admit.
Oh, yeah, it's terribly important. Absolutely.
Can I before anybody else says anything, just because it will lose the thread of this.
Yeah.
The other possible struggle that's important is about the integrity of people who manage higher education, because it is ambiguous. There have been cases which are both encouraging and discouraging. And that's interesting, because it's clear that higher management in universities themselves are taxed by this, and some are falling in with identity politics, but others, to give them their due, are defending academic freedom. And I don't think we should lose that, because it's an important point for us all to play with and communicate with as well.
Phil, I'm sure you've got something to say on this.
Thanks. I think it's been fascinating, David. I've got your book, but I haven't been able to read it yet. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. You offered us in your talk an approach which is about trying to understand how we got here. And you've been followed after your talk by people who are telling us what to do. And I was thinking about this because it seems to me that a way of one of the ways I reacted to what you were saying, because I come from a psychological background, was the reference to depth psychology and cognitive psychology, and it made me realize that you're describing something that I've been thinking about an awful lot and talking about a lot, which is the splitting of the cognitive conscious mind from its origin, which is the body. And the development of the mind is entirely to do with something biological that allows something to take place, which leads to the capacity to think. But the problem with thinking is it can become cut off from reality. Although it begins by facing reality, as Freud said, it very easily gets perverted into denying reality, and it becomes a kind of vacuum in which reality is kept away. Now, one of the things about that is that it is the expression of certainty, and you've been making that very, very clear. And what do we know about certainty? Well, certainly as a therapist, I know that the first thing that happens when you confront somebody who is certain is that you find yourself being certain in response. It's a serious problem that we have, which is why we have to train to be able to avoid doing that. And we learn how to instead move away from the power of the certainty state and to develop a capacity to demonstrate not knowing, because not knowing is the origin of thinking, real thinking. It's about allowing a space in which something can be explored. So it's an alternative to certainty. It's also an alternative to action. It's not that I'm against actions and activity or anything, but I'm against action that hasn't been thought about. And it seemed to me that one of the things that is endemic, and Mary particularly makes a point about this, is that our colleagues are mostly silent. In fact, it's been a phenomenon in the political mind seminar over this last period that there is more silence than conversation.
Particularly on this subject, absolutely.
And particularly on this subject. And I'm really interested in that because I think that this is an action. Silence is an action. It's a retreat and it's an avoidance. But what I think it's a retreat from is the danger of confronting certainty. And so it seems to me that by being able to understand how it's come to be that gender identity has taken over in this way and has restricted thinking, understanding how that's happened allows people then to be able to think about how they can respond to it. And so for me, this is a really important book because it gives us a way of being able to think again. And that we can use to encourage our colleagues, and particularly psychoanalytic colleagues who have remained absolutely silent while gender identity has taken over and while an ethics has been developed in the psychoanalytic community, which says that there are absolute boundaries. Whereas psychoanalysis is about working on the boundary. There's no boundary, it's about an exploration. So there is your book allows us a way of being able to start to understand something. When people recognize it, they can find a voice. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you. I think, Phil, we have to also acknowledge how psychoanalysis has had its certainties too.
Yeah, and it's recovered from them, David.
Yes.
I mean, one of the nice things about psychoanalysis is that it's followed Freud's example, which is that when he discovered that what he was saying was nonsense, he changed his mind.
Yeah. Well, some people might hear it. Okay, we'll come back to that. Anant, can you put your video on? It'd be nice to see you. But,
Yes. 1 minute. Son brought the topic about the lack of negotiation coming from that side. So my point is that it is basic mechanism of identity politics to divide society into various multiple blocks and hand them ideologies. Once you divide the society into multiple blocks and hand them these ideologies, is it not logical to say that when people have these multiple ideologies, they will be in conflict with each other? So therefore, negotiation will go down. So yes, of course, my question is, how do you negotiate with such developments? Second question is, How do you but yeah, second question. Yes, so are we not seeing a sort of subtle social engineering take place? This very changing of minds and society and societal order taking place for political games. Third thing, does identity politics create a good division and divert our attention from other problems such as, at the moment, inflation? United Kingdom has a 40-year high inflation rate and many countries. Oh, yes, answer, please. Thank you.
Can I just say they're all pertinent questions, and the exploration of the relationship between neoliberalism and identity politics is something I do go into in the book. And so, but thanks for those useful questions.
That idea that it's a retreat from bigger anxieties like climate change and the end of the planet.
Yeah.
Makes sense, doesn't it? Daniel, probably the last one actually. Daniel, your mute is on. Or volume, turn your volume up, or.
Okay, I should be.
That's it.
Yeah, now. Okay, thank you. So I wanted to ask if David had looked at the question of identity politics as a sort of manifestation of marketing categories used in automated systems, which are incapable of judging people through human means.
Yeah.
Social media is an obvious example, but also just at the scale of modern communities, especially online communities, it is impossible to know people individually, and therefore putting people into boxes or categories makes them easier to sell things to.
Yes.
And I wonder if what we're seeing is just the manifestation of that marketing strategy, essentially, turned into political real world categories.
Yeah.
I think that's partly true. I think it's certainly well known in the marketing literature about, for instance, the black pound, the pink pound, the grey pound, etc. But in addition to that, there's the ideological function, which I think was hinted at in the previous speaker, about, for example, the way that sports channels are quite happy to endorse Black Lives Matter and to sacralize taking the knee at the beginning of football matches, because it means you don't have to ask wider questions about the role of soccer as a global industry and its relationship to the third world and to working class people and to expensive channels, etc. So, you know, you can unpack soccer as a massive capitalist organization, or you can just say, we want to root out racism wherever we find it by taking the knee. So there is certainly a relationship to be explored there.
Yeah. Look at where they're having the World Cup. Okay, Katrina, I think will have to be the last one, I'm afraid. Katrina.
Yeah, just quite a different thought. Going back to Philip's question and what David's book, I think, is particularly good at, and what I haven't seen in many other places, is the question of how did we get here? And I was just reminded of the one, I had the pleasure of being allowed to read one or two of your draft chapters. The one that totally grabbed me was asking the question about basically the capital interests behind some of identity politics. This was particularly in relation to the trans movement and who's basically bankrolling massive campaigns. Now, talking about higher education, I was really intrigued by that. And I then went, one of the absolute how did I say it? One thing that really irritates me is the anonymous report and support feature, which many UK universities use. I imagine everybody in academia is familiar. So students can anonymously denounce any lecturer. The lecturers have no opportunity ever to find out who this was. They can say, they made me feel uncomfortable. They can say they were racist, whatever, no details needed. So I took David's example and had a little look into this at Company House. And what a surprise, this was founded by 3 young white people in their late 30s at Manchester University who spotted a phenomenal economic opportunity here. And I can't find at the moment, the company behind all of this is called Culture Shift. And they do all this wonderful, wouldn't it be amazing if we could change society and root out racism and sexism and whatever. I mean, the claims are phenomenal. All the employees they show are wonderfully multi-ethnic. So you go, oh, this is obviously a good bunch. Now, they filed their original accounts, the ones I looked at, I think it was in 2019, perhaps, in Company House. They were worth about 120,000. A year later, they were worth 1,125,000. I can't find the latest ones for this year at the moment, but I bet you that they are probably now worth about 4 or 5 million. And I wonder, asking some of those questions, because we asked about political interests and why is the Labour Party so quiet? I suspect it's got quite a lot to do with people covering their own backs and their own livelihoods, as much as sort of political values. But I think if we dig into some of the economic interests and the frankly capitalist interests in a lot of identity politics and how it's being promoted, I think that's actually possibly quite a good way to get more young people on side, because one of the things they definitely aren't very keen on, in my experience, is to massively support a few individuals, making themselves very, very rich by pretending to be the right on guard that leads the change. And I thought that was particularly powerful in David's book. I hadn't asked those questions before. I read your chapter on trans politics and the bankrolling of them.
Yeah, thank you, Katrina. Last word from David and Pragna. A few last words of hope and inspiration.
Just in relation to that last point, I think that can also be said, the economic interests behind race identity politics, where we've seen a mushrooming of diversity training, classes. And it reminds me of the 80s when there used to be racial awareness training instead. And Sivanandan actually critiqued that very effectively and talked about the degradation of the anti-racist struggle instead of focusing on structural, institutionalized forms of racism. It was brought down to the level of personal prejudices and so on. And this kind of training racket was, a major industry, and it also produced a Black middle class. And I think that is exactly what we're seeing now. So we shouldn't underestimate the kind of economic interests there. But I do think ultimately we can only overcome this through political struggle. And it is through political struggle that we can sort of form bonds and relationships that kind of help us to get to where we need to get in terms of our understanding of what we're experiencing and the commonalities. And actually, I think we need to also shift attention away from recognition of difference to a focus on unity and on solidarity. Those for me are key. I think ultimately we can only win this through political struggle. But that's that we're a long way from seeing that in any kind of robust form at the moment.
Thank you, Pragna. David.
No, thanks to everybody for coming tonight. I just second what Pragna's just said, and it's been very encouraging, the conversations we've had with people. Thank you very much to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. And I really, really want to thank David and Pragna, but David for his wonderful book, which I do recommend you go out and buy. It helps us tackle some of this Japanese knotwood that's knocking around, needs our attention, is taking over. So I'd like to thank very much tonight David Pilgrim, who's brought out this wonderful book, and for Pragna for creating such a nice discussion, obviously bringing lots of people in. And we've had unlike our ones at Political Mind, we haven't been all silent. There's been some feelings of political hope and engagement here, which, as Pragna says, is the only way out of this, I think. Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much indeed. Have a lovely weekend. And see you next time. I think we might carry this on in some form or another in Political Mind, but I'll let you know about it. Thank you, David and Pragna again. Good night, everybody.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.